Start in just a couple of minutes. Get yourself some pastries and treats over there and coffee.
Hey, I used that as an answer. He kept saying like, because.
Oh, you have a different idea.
No, I know.
Yeah, no, but that was a good idea.
Yeah, you use that for that. References and all. It's so good. So good.
What do you?
Use your account. That's the way it does.
Yeah, I mean, so many questions. You want to bear with me about it, but
No, it actually helps.
the questions, we.
We're applying it to like material context of like influencers, social media growers, that sort of thing. It's actually things are actually.
The lunch.
It's a little scary.
Yeah, I got the clicker. I got that. All right.
Yes. No, but I've literally done this work. Erosion.
Oh, no.
Trust you on this one.
Then this.
Right, yeah. I'm the position where I'm a common man.
Quick announcement for speakers. There's the board right here, so just watch it when you're back here. All right, well, why don't we get started? Welcome to the Faculty Research Blitz for 2025. Really glad to have you here. For our speakers, we also have a clicker. Working. Where am I supposed to point it?
I just saw a laser beam for a second.
Right. Works and then it doesn't work and then it works. Here needs help again. Yeah.
Yep.
Not working.
Yeah, it's because it was unselected.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so welcome to our annual Research Blitz. So the idea is for us to just give a sampling of our research, teaching, and the student activities going on in the department. And I want to give a big thank you to all the presenters for agreeing to participate in this event. But this event is designed to be quick. So let's get started. So here are the ground rules. Each faculty presenter will have 5 minutes. Dawn will try to give you a 1 minute left warning and a time's up warning, and we're going to be really strict on time because we don't, we got to get everybody in and have a little bit of time for Q&A. I've got a slide show for all the presenters, and then it shows like who will be next, and that's in bold, so you can kind of follow through. And after all the presentations, we are going to have a Q&A session. So think about what kinds of questions you would like to ask the faculty or the student clubs. So we're going to start with student clubs. And I believe the philosophy club is going to come up and do a quick spiel for y'all.
So we just wanted to give a quick pitch for Philosophy Club. We're a discussion-based club that meets to discuss any sort of philosophical topics that are of interest to our members. And we meet Mondays, 7 to 8 in the philosophy department.
It's fun. It's chill. I'll show up.
Great. Next, we have the PPE club.
Hi everyone, my name is Svetlana. I'm one of the student leaders of PPE Club. Very similar to Philosophy Club, we do a lot of discussion-based things, but it's more related to politics, philosophy, and economics. Includes all majors. Like I'm a philosophy major, but I like going because it's a place to learn new things. And aside from discussions, we also do collabs with other clubs. We did a collab with Women in Econ last week. We have professors come in and speak. We do games like we did PPE like topics tier list. We have panels like co-op panels and PPE professors panels and more. So we meet on Tuesdays from 6 to 7 p.m. in RP usually. So I'd love to see you guys come by. Thank you.
MAP.
And finally, hi, I'm Katrina. I'm one of the eMore members for MAP, Minorities in Philosophy. We are also a discussion-based club trying to reimagine what philosophy can look like, methodologies, who we take seriously as philosophers, and trying to expand the canon, either by looking at marginalized figures in philosophy or looking outside of the Western context. And so we meet every other Wednesdays from 6 to 7 in the philosophy conference room. If you're interested in joining, you can either email me or here's the QR code for our Instagram. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so next up we have Katie, and here's the clicker if you want to.
Thanks.
Awesome.
So I'm here to talk about something that's kind of between a club and a working group. There we go. We've got a bunch of awesome reading groups and working groups in our department, and Ethics Bowl is it sits between the clubs and the working groups, I would say, in that it's it's a structured club experience. It's research driven. It's a form of team debate. It's a form of competitive team debate. It sounds kind of icky to say that. I have like a really toxic past background with debate and competitive forms of debate. I don't typically like or support or endorse competitive debate, but Ethics Bowl I think is something that I've seen that it can be healthier. I've seen that it can do a lot better. So Mark Wells and I co-coach the team. You can hang out with me and AB and Mark. I don't know if anybody else is here on the team, but we're a fun group. We're getting ready for a big tournament, which we'll have a little bit more to say about in a second. If you're thinking like, I'd like to be interested, I'm curious, but I'm not sure what we do in Ethics Bowl, then you can take this class. I teach a service learning course called Debating Ethical Controversies. We go through the sort of whole, like from start to finish, what research looks like, what deliberative inquiry looks like in Ethics Bowl. We are in the community a ton, working with different debate organizations. Our service learning partners, 2 primary service learning partners are there. So we work with the Boston Public Schools, supporting and mentoring their middle school and high school debate teams. We're a type of debate called policy debate. We also experiment with a ton of different forms of debate. So we try a lot of things out in the class. We see what it's like to organize ourselves around competitive debate structures that are the most popular forms, at least in our context in the United States. So we try about 10 different types of debate, and then we critically evaluate those forms to see what types of skills we're learning, what types of goals and outcomes at their best they might achieve. And we critically evaluate debate in that class. So the content piece is all driven by the cases that we're working on that semester as a team. So the structural piece is all about critical evaluation of what debate is meant to do and what it actually does. But the content piece is driven by the 15 applied ethics cases that were given by the governing organization of Ethics Bowl. And so we researched those cases. If you want to check it out and see what it's like, see Ethics Bowl in action, next Saturday is our big regional tournament. We're hosting it this year. So actually in this building downstairs in the Raytheon Amphitheater is where you'll find us at 9 a.m. You can see the preliminary round if you'd like to pop in and watch a preliminary round. If you want to come for the final round, that will start about 1:30 and it'll be downstairs in Eagan, the big Raytheon Amphitheater. So in this building downstairs. So come and check it out, see what it's like, maybe join the team. For the spring, we're doing bioethics. So it'll be all bioethics cases. Okay, cool, thank you.
So next we have Dawn. I guess I'll have to find you.
Yeah, you'll have time me.
Great.
Hi, I'm Don Fallis. I usually I do a lot of research on lying and deception, including the ways in which technology and artificial intelligence affects lying and deception. So I do stuff on fake news and deep fakes. But more recently, I've been working on a slightly different project. I've been looking at how we use reasoning to expand our knowledge, in particular deductive reasoning. And so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what I'm doing there. There's kind of a standard story about how deductive reasoning allows us to expand our knowledge. If we know that certain premises are true, like Socrates is human, that all humans are mortal, and we know that our inferences are valid, then it's guaranteed that our conclusion will be true. So it seems like we know our conclusion, but sometimes things don't go as planned, and sometimes we're mistaken about our premises being true, or we're mistaken about our inferences being valid. So, for example, in this case, it might turn out that unexpectedly Socrates is actually a Martian, and so our first premise is false. If one of those things happens, our premises are false, or our conclusion is invalid, then it might be that if one of our premises is false and or our inferences are invalid, it might be that our conclusion is false. Moreover, even if our conclusion is true, it's not clear that we know that the conclusion is true. Now, this situation raises a few puzzles that I'm currently working on. One issue is that some philosophers think that even if some of your premises are false, you can still use deductive reasoning to acquire knowledge. So a standard example is like if I brought handouts for my talk today, and I have 50 handouts, and I very carefully count how many people are in the audience, but turns out that I'm off by one. I think there's 21 people, but there's only 20. In that case, the first premise of my argument here would be false. But nevertheless, it still seems like I probably know that I have enough handouts for everyone. But exactly how is this possible? Another issue is that since we sometimes make mistakes, deductive reasoning doesn't actually guarantee that our conclusion is going to be true. In addition, it turns out that in some instances, there's actually non-deductive or probabilistic methods that are more reliable than deductive reasoning, given the fact that humans are fallible. But despite this, mathematicians, for the most part, completely refuse to use non-deductive methods to establish truth of mathematical claims. They claim that that probabilistic non-deductive methods can't give us mathematical knowledge. And so one of the puzzles that I'm working on at the moment is exactly why not? And the answers to these questions turn on exactly what knowledge is and why it's valuable. And these are sort of the main topics in the philosophical subdiscipline of epistemology, or theory of knowledge. And I'm actually going to be teaching a course in the spring on theory of knowledge, and we're going to discuss these puzzles and a bunch of other puzzles about knowledge. Thank you very much.
Next is Amy.
Just trying to put slides together, so they're just big words.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Nancy Thresher. I'm a philosopher of science and science ethicist in the department. I'm also co-listed with public policy. I think a lot about sort of the policy implications of the philosophical work I'm doing. So I have sort of two major areas of research. One is ecobiotech ethics and environmental ethics more broadly. Within that, I think a lot about the ways that genetic engineering and new genetic tools can help us with environmental problems. So I'm working on a couple of different papers in that space right now. So one of them looks at the ways that we deal with, well, both of them look at the ways we deal with invasive species. So there's this real crisis in the way that we handle our conservation work, in that we have this big, bold, beautiful claims. We're going to save the environment. We're going to remove invasive species. But we often do that via like mass murdering in very painful ways a lot of animals, right? Like we poison them to death. We hunt them. We target diseases at them. We do all sorts of terrible things. And so I've been thinking through a lot about the ways that biotech can come in and help solve this sort of like ethical conundrum. So using genetic techniques like gene drives to sort of breed species out of existence, for want of a better word. And there's a lot of promise to these technologies, I think. So there's a lot of risks associated with them, but I, in fact, think we might have ethical obligations to pursue this research and things like that, kinds of things. So I think a lot about sort of these, like the promises of these new technologies. I do a lot of work that's very interdisciplinary. I'm currently co-authoring a paper on a broader set of topics around carp removal in Australia with a carp invasion or invasive species biologist. We're thinking about different ways of removing invasive species and using carp as a case study. So like we're sort of making arguments basically aimed at the Australian government, trying to convince them to think about better ways to deal with things in the current plan, which is, and I quote, their Carpageddon plan, which involves releasing carp herpes into the waterways of Australia to remove carp. We're basically being like, wow, that seems both exciting and not at all what we ought to be doing. I don't have slides anymore, so I'm going to, doesn't matter, but we might want to get that fixed. Okay, so, and I teach environmental ethics. So that's one of the classes I teach. If you're interested in any of these sorts of things, my environmental ethics class tends to be very technology oriented. We talk a lot about geoengineering, genetic modification. Today we covered philosophy of environmental robots and the ways those can help. So if you're interested in those kinds of things, like come take my environmental ethics class. The other big thing I work on is that a lot of my work is moving towards outer space ethics. So I'm a research lead at the Next Generation Event Horizon Telescope. They're based over at Harvard, where I run their responsible sighting working group. So this is the group that, if any of you saw those big pictures of the black holes that came out a few years back, like that's us. I work on where to build scientific infrastructure for them. So where do you put your telescopes, which are often on like very high mountains, which tend to be culturally significant and religiously important and like environmentally vulnerable, right? Tops of mountains tend to be very unique places. And so I spend a lot of time traveling around places like Wyoming or Tanzania to meet with local communities, consult with them on like what it might look like to buy into these projects and have the benefits of the science go out to them. More broadly, I think a lot about the way that we're emerging into space. And the like kind of ethics of the new space age. So, you know, there are all these groups agitating for positioning weapons in space, for example. How do we think about like space as a global commons? How might weapons in low Earth orbit change the way we use space? I think about space junk, these problems of like the environmental impact of the new space age and these like debris floating around up there. There's all this alarming evidence coming out that one of the ways we get rid of satellites is we burn it up in the upper atmosphere. You just like deorbit them and they burn up and that's lovely. And now about 20% of the particles in the upper atmosphere are from satellites, right? And we're geoengineering. That's changing the reflection of our like atmosphere. And so there's like deep ethical environmental questions associated with the new space age. And as sort of a conjunction of my like biotech work and my space work, we've also just put out a public policy brief arguing for why we need to be thinking more proactively about biotech in space. You know, genetically engineering crops to allow us to grow them on Mars, the biological basis for our life support systems, and in a broader sense, right, what happens when you genetically engineer humans to do better in space, those sorts of things. So I think about a lot of these things. I'm hoping to teach some philosophy of science at various points. We'll do a lot of space as part of that. But if you're interested in any of these topics, please come and chat with me. I've got lots of cool research that I'm happy to chat with more people about, but I'll end it there.
Yeah.
Hi there. I was too lazy this week to make slides. I wrote some stuff down. So I teach logic here, which has really been super fun. Actually, I think I'm probably teaching my last advanced logic course here next semester. If you're interested in doing that, I'm just going to be teaching intro after that, which I don't have to advertise because everyone has to take it. Like it or not, I'm stuck with me now. Okay. So I do research in a lot of different areas. Logic, obviously, epistemology, philosophy of science, and I'm especially interested in reasoning and inference, the kind of stuff Don was talking about. I'm also interested in cognitive scientific aspects of reasoning. How do people actually reason? When do they reason well? When do they reason poorly? How does that relate to the work that philosophers do? One thing that I've gotten into in my career as well is the use of computational methods, not just to do logic, but to also reason about probability and things like that. And I've gotten really back into that lately. So one thing I did with one of our former students, Kwasi Ajorlolo, is we developed a really nice piece of software that we debuted this semester in logic. It's a probability machine. So you can just type in arbitrary constraints in probability, and it'll give you examples if there are any, or it'll tell you that there are no such examples. So I'm still enjoying innovating in the pedagogical space using computational methods. But I'm also doing research. I'll tell you one example from recently. I've gotten really interested in conditionals, if-then statements, both in logic and in natural language. And I discovered last year that there was this important open question about maybe the first serious logic book really written in the modern era by Frege. It's called the Begriffsschrift. In that book, he provides the first formal system for what we now know as logic, what we learn in intro logic. And it's a very simple system. It just has a conditional and negation, and then it has modus ponens as a rule of inference, and that has a bunch of axioms. And there was an open question, which I didn't know about until last year. I didn't even know it was open. And the question is, does his formal system, which was the first one for the conditional in logic, does it actually determine a unique conditional? Anyway, that was open for, since 1879, or probably people were thinking about it since the 1930s. Well, the reason no one figured it out is because you can't really figure this out by hand. So we were able to use theorem proving methods, computational methods, to discover a counterexample and show that it's not unique. But they're very complicated examples. They're not things you would discover by hand. So I love this kind of thing, using computational methods to help us as like prosthetics for our thinking and help us solve problems. I'm really interested in that. So I've been doing a lot of that again and really trying to leverage the technology. Everyone talks about the new AI, with all the machine learning stuff. But old AI is thriving and it's advancing. Many of you may not know, but for instance, Amazon makes 1 billion calls a day to a theorem prover, an old-fashioned AI machine, to check and make sure that everything in their databases is correct and that they're reasoning correctly about what's happening with their information. So I just want to make a little pitch for old-fashioned AI. Those are the kind of tools that I work on. It's still really important. And well, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, come talk to me, because I'll be around.
Hey, everybody. I am Rory. I'm the chair of the department. I also run the Rossetti Family Program for the Advancement of Humanities. We meet as a reading research group every days we meet now, Tuesdays. And right now we have Professor Thresher coming telling us about philosophy of time as of recently, which has been a ton of fun. If you're interested in that, let me know. But I'm gonna say a little bit about something else.
You gotta go down, actually.
Yeah. Here's something I've been thinking about recently. By the way, in the spring, I'm teaching a philosophy of biology course. So topics like this are going to be discussed in that course. So this year, I started a grant with a couple of co-authors at different institutions on the emergence and evolution of goal-directed behavior in collective entities. This is funded by Johnny T. We're thinking about complex biological systems. You think about it, like most biological systems are pretty complex. You think about yourself, like your body, it's really just a collection of human cells. But if you expand your view just a little bit, in fact, you are not just a collection of human cells. You have as many non-human cells living on and in your body as you do human cells. And if you remove those cells, you will die. So they're kind of important for your biological functioning. You are a complex system, and not just a complex system, you're a complex ecosystem. So one of the things we're interested in is studying all these complex systems. Termites are one of my favorites. And figuring out how different organisms that might even have competing interests might start working together so intimately that they become kind of a distinct organism themselves, an individual. They start acting like their own entity and can think about them as an individual. So we're trying to figure out how that comes about. It's complicated, so let me tell you a little bit about termites. For instance, termite mounds are really interesting. So this is actually the face of a termite mound. There are these fungi that are growing out of the termite mound. These are fungi that are cultivated by the termites. In fact, the fungi can't live without the termites. They need the termites to do the farming. And the termites are dependent on the fungi for food. So this really nice codependence there. Inside the gut of a termite is bacteria and microorganisms that can break down wood. Termites can't digest wood on their own. They would die without those bacteria. And the bacteria can't live outside the termites. So again, you got this nice codependence. This whole system is working together in an interesting way. One question you might have is, if they need each other. Who's really driving the show? Is this the termite that are using the bacteria to do digesting? Or are the bacteria using the termite to get the wood? Right? You can think about it in multiple ways. And it turns out that there are ways to sort of systematically investigate who's driving the show in the evolutionary context. And so that's what we've been doing. So got a project right now I'm calling the Game of Red Thrones. And it's basically like when you have different organisms, like in the termite bacteria in its gut, they evolve way faster than the termites do. Termites are slow reproducers compared to bacteria. And a lot of these systems, one species evolves way faster than the other ones. The question is, how does that speed affect the dynamics of the interaction? And there are two like hypotheses about how that speed might go, and they cut in different directions. The red king hypothesis says the slower evolving species typically has the advantage. The fig trees have the advantage over the fig wasps. Why? Because they get to design the environment for the fig wasps. The termites boss the show when it comes to their gut bacteria. The red queen, on the other hand, says, no. Speed matters, and you want to be a fast mover in evolution. So we've been using some computational prosthetics, as Brandon said, to investigate this question. We build these complicated game theoretic models, and we run simulations on them and see what happens. And it turns out that we can say very precisely under what circumstances we'll get the red king, under what circumstances we'll get the red queen. And we've seen in these models the evolution of what's called obligate mutualism, where they have to live together, so they can start living separately, then they have to live together after a while. We also can get the evolution of obligate parasitism, where the host can't live without its parasite, but is worse off because of the parasite. Yeah. Okay.
Next, we have Sarah.
Hi, everybody. Hope you can hear me. Okay, great. Thank you. Apologies for not being there in person. I'm doing research on the weekend, so I'm away from campus. Hi, I'm so glad you all could come today. I teach religious studies in the department. My research interests are in religion, media, and politics in the U.S., and I specifically work with a group of Christians called Orthodox Christians. And so my project that I'm going to tell you a little bit about today that I'm just starting is with that community. In terms of courses, I teach Intro to Religious Studies, cults. I also teach topical seminars, and I teach classes in anthropology and women's gender and sexuality studies. Let me see if I can move on to the next screen. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about a new project I'm starting. I just got a grant this summer from the Louisville Institute to work on LGBTQ plus Christians in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. For those of you that don't know, Eastern Orthodoxy is one of the three branches of Christianity: Catholicism, Protestantism, and Eastern Orthodoxy, and it's considered a quite conservative religious community. And there are a wide variety of Orthodox Christians throughout the United States. You might have heard about Russian Orthodox Christians, Greek Orthodox Christians. You might have gone to a wonderful Euro setup at a Greek church near you in your neighborhood. Those are the communities I work in. Largely, Orthodox Christians in the United States are conservative on views of gender and sexuality. And so I am interested in why Orthodox Christians who identify as LGBTQ plus might stay in the Orthodox Church, even though it is often environmentally hostile to them and to their lives. So that's part of my project. And I'm going to show you what I'm going to do in terms of methods really quick. Also, these amazing images are not my creation, but a creation of an interlocutor I'm working with who is helping me with this project. So my research question is, how do LGBTQ plus Orthodox Christians queer the church and find, and the larger question asks how they find spaces to affirm their identity and also affirm their spiritual kinship and faith. The communities I'm working in are active Orthodox Christians, so those who are participating in church. I'm also interested in talking to former Orthodox Christians, those who have left their churches. They may have left religion altogether. I'm curious why they leave, when they leave, and where they find meaning after they leave in terms of spirituality and religion. I'm also talking to Orthodox Christians who are creating affirming or inclusive faith communities that aesthetically and functionally look like Orthodox communities, but are not in affiliation with the Orthodox Church. So this is a long-term interdisciplinary project. I use fieldwork, which means I go out in the field and I talk to people, I interview them, I participate in their communities, I sit with them for long periods, I have coffee, I get to know them. This is part of being an anthropologist. And I also combine that with thinking about their theological or approaches to understanding God and approaches to understanding their sexuality and gender identification. And I'm a feminist anthropologist, which means that I'm using feminist anthropological methods. And one of those is patchwork ethnographic research, which is a short-term type of research, which means you're popping in and out of communities. And this is a way to sort of decolonize the method and take seriously the fact that your folks you're working with often have limitations, they have jobs, they have families, and being there full time in their communities might be a burden to them. It also might be a cause to create tension in a community, particularly if the people you're working with are not out. And to avoid that risk, I do patchwork ethnography, which means I pop in and out of communities so people are not sure like when I'm coming or if I'm there long term. I also interview people anonymously if they choose to, and I interview people digitally so that I can create a more inclusive space for people who are not able to host me in person. So that's the project I'm working on right now. I'm doing that full time starting in the spring and summer, and hopefully this project will continue on for at least the next 2 or 3 years. Thanks, everyone.
Ready? Oh, it's me. All right, so I'm Professor Kay Matisen, and I have 2 main areas of research and teaching. One is information ethics. I teach tech and human values, and I also teach an upper level online course called information ethics. And my overall project and approach is what I call information justice or informational justice, that looks at our rights and obligations as seekers of information, sources of information, and subjects of information. So that'd be when we need information, what kind of rights and obligations do we have? When we want to, when someone's talking about us, the information is about us, what kind of rights and obligations do we have? And when we want to share information, what kind of rights and obligations do we have? So for each of those, there's things I'm either working on actively or thinking about. The first one is in terms of secrets of information, is a project I'm doing with Don Fallis on digital epistemic fakes. So, we've got a lot of online fakes these days, and in particular, they tend to be epistemic fakes. That is, it's faking a knowledge resource. Either it's faking another person who can be a good source of knowledge, or it's faking being a video of something real. So it's faking being that kind of source of knowledge when we talk about deep fakes. And so we're working on that. Dawn has developed, with my help, an analysis of what a fake is, because that's an important question if we're talking about fakes. And then we're looking at the general ethical questions around those kinds of fakes and what we should do about it. Are we really headed towards the infopocalypse or not? Then I'm also working on a project on rights we have as subjects of information. That includes issues of privacy. And in particular, I'm interested in thinking about privacy in relation to predictive algorithms. Standardly, we've thought about privacy as something about people observing us, observing private information, taking private information, or observing us in private moments. And then the problem is there's this privacy invasion in terms of they're getting the information about us. But now that's no longer the case, because they can take a lot of what seems like innocuous, often public information about us, or trivial information that we wouldn't think was important to protect, and using large data sets, and algorithms, they can predict things about us that are very personal. So one example is by looking at if you're an online space where you're sharing text, there's scientists who say we can predict by just looking at your text exchanges whether or not you have schizophrenia. Having schizophrenia seems like a very private piece of information about me, but I was openly sharing this text. I wasn't trying to hide it because I had no idea that anyone could make such an inference. So how do we think about privacy when it's not about them collecting information about us, but it's about their ability to make predictions of us? And finally, looking at our rights as sources of information, the thing I'm thinking about right now, inspired by my students, is really the ways that our rights as subjects of information and our rights to be sources of information interact, the ways in which the kinds of invasions of privacy, the kind of collection of data on us, the capacity to predict private information about us, how all that is leading us to start to self-censor because we're afraid of what kinds of information people can get about us. So the lack of privacy is, in this climate in particular, leading to a lack of a capacity for freedom of speech because we're self-censoring. All right, so those are some things I'm thinking about information ethics. Another area of research I'm working on is philosophy of neurodivergence. There's a lot of interesting, oh great, I got 1 minute left. I'll just go very fast. There's a bunch of fascinating questions in philosophy of neurodivergence, questions about metaphysics, what even is autism, epistemology, how do we know about it, phenomenology, what is it like to be autistic or have ADHD, what is our experience of the world, ethics, should we try to teach neurodivergent people to act normal? And finally, I'm working on a current project on a paper called neuronormative gaslighting. It's the way in which autistic and or ADHD people are gaslit by neuronormative standards that basically, as this quote from Catalan, the privileged so-called neurotypical set of assumptions, norms, and practices that constitute neurotypicality as the sole acceptable or superior mode of cognition. The imposition of those standards lead to a form of gaslighting of neurodivergent people, which then leads them to fail to have a kind of self-confidence in their own knowledge and in their own capacities as subjects. All right, thank you. That's right. How about for Judith as well? So Judith just sent along a slide for me, one of our faculty members at Mills, and she just wanted to let you all know that she is teaching an online synchronous, so you'll meet online, a course on women and religion. And the course takes a historical and comparative look at the ways in which women have understood and experienced gender, leadership roles, meaning, and self-understanding in Vodun, I don't know how to pronounce that, Native American, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and traditional African religious traditions. It's going to discuss attitudes towards the body, involving sexuality, purity, fertility, and seclusion, in a comparative context, as will the meanings of gender and religious symbolism, myth, and ritual, to address the central question: what does the experience of religious women contribute to an awareness of the sacred, to the understanding of community, and ultimately to the meaning of being human? And this course fulfills a couple of new paths, they call it new paths, engaging differences in diversity and interpreting culture. All right. And next is Adam.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Super. And can you see my slides? Can you all see my slides?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Terrific. All right. Great to hear everybody's work. Nice to see you all from afar. Wow, those are all tough acts to follow. So I've been working for the last few years mostly on the issue of discrimination, which you might think is you might think, oh, isn't it obvious? What's discriminatory? Discriminatory when you rely on someone's race and you treat them differently based on their race. But it turns out that there are quite different understandings of discrimination that show up in our legal and political practice, and they have really different implications. So one easy way to see this is to look at the current Supreme Court. So the court has a current kind of right-leaning court has a very specific understanding of discrimination as basically putting people in racial categories, putting people in racial boxes. So in the case of racial discrimination. So, and that seems kind of intuitive on its face. Okay, isn't it kind of wrong to see people mainly through their race and not see them as individuals or something like that? But if you think about discrimination in that way, you end up having a perhaps surprising set of views about particular practices. So for example, you end up being against affirmative action. Why? Because affirmative action requires putting people in racial categories. You get an extra couple points on your admissions form or whatever it may be in light of your race. Another place, just to flag something that's kind of currently in the news, I don't know if you all have been following the case about the Voting Rights Act that was just in the last couple, argued in the last couple of weeks, and will potentially create a truly tectonic shift in American politics. What was going on there is that the Voting Rights Act requires us to notice where Black voters seem to be getting kind of shut out of the political system. So one way that can happen is intentionally, of course, where a state just decides directly to prevent Black people from voting or from having or tries to design districts so that they have less of an influence. But another way it can happen is unintentionally. So for example, suppose that a state, and this is common in the South, suppose that a state like Louisiana gerrymanders its districts, that is, designs its districts in order to create partisan advantage, typically for the Republicans in a state like that. Well, these are states where race strongly correlates with partisan affiliation. So if you are designing your map in order to advantage Republicans, you're de facto going to be designing your map to benefit the white voters over the Black voters. So what happens when you notice that that's when there's been that kind of partisan gerrymandering and it's had that racial effect? Well, traditionally what's happened is that the courts have stepped in and created these quote unquote opportunity districts where they said, okay, we've got whole states here where Black voters basically never get to elect anybody who is a politician of their choice. So what we'll do is we'll require these states to create some districts where Black folks are in the majority. But what we saw at the oral argument recently, and it's kind of a complicated backdrop, but it's a really important case. What we saw at the oral argument recently was the right-leaning justices started to say, hey, wait a minute, if you all are creating these districts, these opportunity districts, you're doing that based on race. You're categorizing people based on race to decide who goes into this district rather than this district. And so you're putting people in racial boxes. This can't be allowed. So it's quite possible that the courts will gut that part of the Voting Rights Act based on this concern about racial boxing. So I've been trying to argue for an alternative view of what counts as discrimination, including racial discrimination, where the point of anti-discrimination laws and point of anti-discrimination norms is not to avoid putting people in racial boxes, but in order to ensure that everybody's fully included, that it has certain kinds of equal opportunities in society. And that leads you to, I think, quite different views about affirmative action, about these racial gerrymanders, things like the use of standardized tests that sometimes work against people of color in admissions. And I've also looked at some stuff outside of the context of race, for example, gender dress codes, some things about trans rights and so on. So yeah, I've been looking at this in a bunch of papers, and I have a forthcoming book on discrimination. Very briefly about my teaching. So I direct the PPE program, and something I've been working on the last few years is especially this, I know, kind of strangely technical sounding named class, which is Phil 3000 Interdisciplinary Methods for PPE. And Basically, the idea was, I did PPE myself as an undergraduate, but my feeling was that standardly in PPE degrees, everybody takes their philosophy, takes their politics, takes their economics, but they never get to do the thing that I think of as being kind of the point of a PPE degree, which is to be able to use all three of those things to address important social problems. And so thanks, that interdisciplinary class is a space where we do that. We look at things like housing, policing, workplace democracy, and that. And I'll also, just so you know, it's a service learning class where we work with local partners who are working on some of those important issues, such as housing. I teach a bunch of other classes too. Intro to Economic Justice is a PPE class. I'm currently teaching a class in immigration, which is a topic I also talk about in global justice. And I'm also always very excited about our newish philosophy of race and racism class, where we talk about philosophical issues about what race is and what counts as racism and so on. All right, thanks very much, and hope I'll see more of you around, and always happy to talk about all these issues.
Yeah, Adam, can you stop sharing the slide? Great, thank you. All right. This is Jacob.
Do I hit the O?
The down arrow.
Hi, everyone. My name's Jacob Stump. I teach philosophy here. I teach ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and philosophy of emotions in this course called How to Flourish Despite Almost Anything. You heard of Socrates? I wrote dialogues about him. Other people at the same time wrote dialogues too. There was this guy Xenophon, wrote this dialogue called The Symposium, features Socrates. At one point in that dialogue, Socrates is asked what he's most proud of. You know the guy. How you think he's going to respond? What's he most proud of? Just say it. What do you think? I mean, whatever. Some of you know him. What's Socrates proud of? I only have 5 minutes. I mean, come on. What's he proud of? What's he proud of?
Wrangling people.
Wrangling people. What else?
Overestimating himself.
Yeah, sensible. Super wrong. In fact, what he says he's most proud of is erotic matchmaking. You don't find this only in Xenophon, you find it in Plato too. Socrates talks about his erotic art, like art in the sense of craft or expertise or skill. I got this paper, it's forthcoming. If you're like having trouble sleeping, tell me, I'll send it to you. But it's like trying to make sense of this claim of Socrates as having an erotic art. I argue it's like this, like call to mind the thing you value the most. Like the thing you think if you got it, then amazing, you'd have like the best life. The thing you're in love with. The thing you're in love with in like Plato talk is the thing you erotically desire. So I give this account where Socrates has this exceptional interpersonal perceptive skill. He can identify the thing you value the most, the thing you're erotically desiring, convince you the way you're trying to get it isn't going to work. Instead, you got to do philosophy to have a chance at getting it. So it's kind of like you want to be a partner in an international law firm. That's like amazing. But don't go study business. That's not going to help you. Then do philosophy to get there. Okay. Anyway, that's one thing. Oh yeah, second thing. Your stoicism is like so trendy everywhere. People really like it, especially young men. I used to really like it. I thought it was an effective way of relating to my inner life. Now, I think it's destructive. I don't like it. But it's everywhere, and there's hardly anything being written for a popular audience that argues against it. I don't know of anything like that, actually. I'm working on this book. I'm trying to write it really accessible. I want you to find it at like the airport bookstore. That sort of book. It argues stoicism stupid, basically. It tells you to use your reasoning to defeat your emotions. In fact, Seneca, he's like a top Stoic. He says your emotions are evil. And all through the Stoic text, you find these like militaristic metaphors. You need to beat up on your emotions. They are your enemies. That's explicit. I think this has the potential to ruin your life and your relationships with people you care about. 2 reasons. One, like emotions aren't responsive to reasoning. There's sophisticated arguments in the philosophy of emotions to support that point. 2, yeah, you got emotions. You can't get away from them. Might as well like take care of them, make peace with them, welcome them, acknowledge them, instead of beat them up. If you relate to them as your enemies, you're going to be unhappy. There's like some arguments and stuff, but that's the basic point. Okay, thanks.
Okay, next is Ron.
Going after stump. It's the Oh, I got backwards.
Yeah, you gotta go down.
Makeup stump. No, that's who I am. And I teach moral philosophy and environmental ethics primarily. I do research in moral philosophy and environmental ethics. I'm going to talk a little bit about conservation philosophy and conservation biology. Conservation biology seems like it's been a long, well, I don't know. It's a new thing. So the Society for Conservation Biology and the word biodiversity were first created in the 1980s. So it's only about 40 years that we've been systematically applying scientific methods to try to prevent species extinctions. And in the 80s, there was this very, the field when it was created in the 80s, very quickly coalesced around a certain kind of model. This is what I call the standard conservation paradigm. And the basic idea of the standard conservation paradigm is that the goal is to limit and remediate human impacts on natural and ecological systems and populations. So the basic idea is we want to not degrade the systems, and if we have degraded them, we want to restore them. Why do we want to do that? Well, in environmental ethics, environmental philosophy was created about the same time. Doesn't go back much further. I mean, all these things have historical roots, but they kind of coalesced into a distinctive field. And the first project was to try to make sense of this and appeal to lots of different types of values that support this goal. The idea was you have this goal, you have all these values that support pursuing that goal, and there's these strategies that became kind of the bread and butter of the way in which you limit degradation. And what you would try to do is create parks and reserves, limit human taking of at-risk species, try to get rid of species that were introduced, those are non-native species, engage in restoration where there's already degradation, then breed and reintroduce animals. Okay, so you got this goal, you got these values that support the goal, and you've got these strategies. Fast forward 40 years, climate change, macro scale anthropogenic change, species are moving everywhere, populations exploding. This model is coming apart. It's not working. The reason it's not working is that the things that are driving species to be at risk of extinction now are not these local things that the strategies try to address, but they're global processes. You can't save polar bears if the reason why polar bears are at risk is because the global mean surface air temperature is going up, so their ice is melting, by designating them their areas parks or something. It's not like the ice is going to be go, oh, it's not a thing. So, okay, so it's not working very well under these kind of conditions. More and more species are at risk in these ways. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the depth and scope of the impacts are such that there's no going back. And the rate of change is so high that there's no going back. So conservation, so the conservation model, values it's underpinned on, the basic strategies are all starting to come apart. So like I say, it's a good time to be an environmental philosopher because everything is kind of up for grabs. And one thing that is going on is a lot of interest in engineering conservation outcomes. So using very different sorts of ecosystem engineering techniques and bioengineering techniques to try to engineer the systems and species so that they're better adapted to the new kinds of ecological environments that we're in. This is a radical departure from that old paradigm. The old paradigm was all about how do we limit our activities to make space for other species. And now what we're asking is how do we engineer other species so that they fit in with us? Total flip. So there's a lot of interesting philosophy going on in the background. Professor ANSI, Professor Thresher, is also working on this stuff and mentioned some of these cases, these things earlier. Okay, so here's the kind of things that this research involves.
some concept and categorical theoretical questions, like what are the concepts that we should use when thinking about conservation and ecosystem management? If the old concepts like native, non-native, natural, unnatural, if those kinds of concepts, historical range are all breaking down, we need new conceptual resources. What ethical frameworks will we use to try to make evaluations under these contexts? That's the normative piece. So that's the theoretical piece, the normative piece. And then the overarching question is, should we embrace this more engineering-oriented approach to our relationship to the non-human world? And if you're interested in these kinds of questions or space ethics, the Environmental Philosophy Working Group meets every week on Fridays at noon to talk about these kinds of issues. Right, and you can send me an email at that address. I'll add you to the Teams list, and you are welcome to come. Yeah, thank you.
Wang is our next speaker. Narrow down.
Yeah, okay. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. My name is Yafeng Wang. I'm a philosopher of science, teaching courses like human values, moral and social problems in healthcare. Next semester, I'm teaching science and pseudoscience. So I would just describe one thing that I've been doing, what the problem is. And I would describe the problem as a problem in the social sciences concerning finding evidence for what I call singular causation, or essentially what kind of methods can social scientists use to determine or to evaluate what caused a particular historical outcome. Example. So in the 1960s in the US, there was late 60s, there was a pretty drastic shift in the federal government concerning its crime policies. So major legislations were passed, both in terms of harsher policies and also massively buff up the amount of money the federal government gives the state to enhance their law enforcement capacities. So this is not exactly what you would call nowadays mass incarceration, but it did provide the groundwork for trends such as drastically increasing incarceration rate and prison population would eventually lead to this thing that we now know as mass incarceration. So social scientists are interested in historical outcomes like this, and they want to know what's going on. For instance, what's happening during the mid to late 60s that caused those shifts, caused those legislation to be proposed and passed, right? And those things have policy implications. So for instance, people who want to maybe change something about mass incarceration, understanding the cause may potentially be relevant. Some of the causal explanations or causes have been proposed in the literature are things like perhaps the change of the legislation is in response to the rising crime rate, which had been happening actually back starting from maybe the 50s, going steadily both in terms of violent and property crimes. There are also certain race-based causes that's being proposed. One idea is we had the civil rights progress, like the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, and also a lot of protest riots that's happening in the 60s. Many of the voters didn't like it, and the voters' preference got electorally expressed. Politicians respond by giving harsher crime policies, and that would be so-called backlash hypothesis. There are also people who argue that this is actually an elite-driven process where there are certain politicians, many of them segregationist or former segregationists, who didn't like what's happening, something like the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, and they respond by using crime as a new issue to advance their own agenda. So these are a couple of hypotheses, and the truth could be one of these or a combination of these or something that's not here. But the question ultimately for social scientists is, what's the evidence of any of those things? How do they find evidence for or against a particular hypothesis for a cause for a particular historical outcome? And this turns out to be a kind of strangely non-straightforward question. What kind of methods are available? So on the one hand, social scientists do this kind of thing all the time. They argue for or against singular causes for singular historical outcome. So you can read history, like international relations. People do this all the time. At the same time, if you ask the question, what are the methods for doing this? It's much less straightforward. There are literature that gives you a list of like existing or proposed methods for doing this. But for each method, there are a lot of foundational debates about what's this method? Is this really a method? How does it work? Why does it work? When does it work? Compare this to another type of causation, which we may call type level or general causation, which is not causes of a single historical outcome, but rather causes of a type of phenomenon over a population. Things like what causes student score to rise over a larger student population. Because those kind of general type level causation can leverage larger data sets, you can use social scientists do actually have a pretty well-defined tool set to address that kind of question. But in the case of singular causation, it's literally like there's a toolkit, and if you open the toolkit, it's not clear exactly what's in there. So the research question, and this is where many social scientists and philosophers are contributing simultaneously and talking to each other, is about figuring out, can we actually make the tools more clear and articulate what the reasoning patterns is? So one thing that I will give one example will be something like the following. So this is one particular research political scientist that I looked at. And basically what I do is I turn this paper, which is 50 pages long, into a general description for what kind of thing is going on, what's the general inferential strategies. And essentially it can be described as an if-then conditional, namely that for one of the hypothesis, the elite-driven process, if that was a cause of this punitive shift, you would actually be able to derive some observational consequences from that. Things like the specific policy you would expect to see, and the timing of the crime policy shift, and the identity or the kind of people who push for those policies will be unique depending on which cause you are talking about, for instance, elite-driven process. So this is just one of those processes where we look at how the practitioners actually do things, try to extract some reasoning pattern, and use that as a starting point to see if we can figure out what the method is and why it works. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Serena, arrow down.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks to Dawn and Kay for organizing this. It's such a great, so great to see so many people turning out. So my name is Professor Serena Perrick, and I'm actually not teaching at the moment. At the moment, I'm an associate dean, faculty affairs, which just means that my entire workload involves supporting faculty and chairs. So I don't interact with students. I'm not teaching at the moment, which is actually a big loss for me because I love teaching and I love getting to know students. I teach similar classes that Professor Hussein teaches, economic justice, social and political philosophy, and so forth. My area of research, though, is in social and political philosophy, broadly speaking, and particularly I focus on refugees and immigration and asylum. And I've spent most of my career trying to make arguments for something I care very much about, which is how refugees and asylum seekers are treated around the world. And I think what I wanted to mention to students is like, philosophy allows you to think really deeply about the things you care about. And it's terrible because once you do that, you realize how incredibly complex they are and intractable and how difficult it is to find solutions. But you also realize that there's room for hope and there's areas you can push against to try to make arguments that support the things that you value. This has been a particularly bleak time to work on asylum and refugees because things go in waves, but right now, globally speaking, I think we should treat refugees really well, and like we're down here, you have to make arguments why they shouldn't just be tortured to death. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about a chapter that I'm working on at the moment. This has to do with how we should think about what I call the asylum integration paradox. And this chapter, I bring together like two different kinds of philosophy. One is sort of post-colonial theory that you might be aware of, like some people thinking about how the legacy of colonialism should be brought to bear on contemporary situations. And then liberal political philosophy, the more standard Anglo-American philosophy. And both groups talk about migration, but very often, mostly not together. And I think there's a reason for this, and I try to sort of unpack that in this chapter. And ultimately, I think both are problematic, but you can see the problems in the other approach by thinking about the other school of thought. So the asylum integration paradox is something like this. Every country that accepts asylum seekers wants asylum seekers to integrate once they're allowed to stay. their children are going to learn their native language, they're going to get a job, they're going to be self-supporting, et cetera, et cetera. This is a goal that everyone has. Asylum seekers themselves share this goal, something everybody wants. And yet asylum seekers as a group integrate the worst among any group of newcomers to society, all immigrants. And so you might think, like, well, why is this? And people on the right want to say, well, it's because asylum seekers are intrinsically problematic, right? They come from formerly colonized countries, they're very poor, the language of civilization is often used. But it turns out, in the social sciences literature, it's very clear why this is the case. Every single country, with very few exceptions, prevent asylum seekers from accessing labor markets for a long time, like 6 months to several years. And this has demonstrable effects that people have looked at over decades on people's ability to integrate, where you're cut off from social networks, you don't know the language as well, you don't know how the economy works, so your asylum claim is accepted, and then you're supposed to start integrating, but you've already been sort of working in the shadows for a long time. So we know that works, and yet no country enacts this policy. And so the question is why? You claim to value integration, and you don't allow asylum seekers access to the things they need to integrate well. So you might think, well, people are just mistaken. Maybe they don't know about this. We've known about this for decades. You might think, well, it's this inconsistency. And other people will say, well, obviously, the reason is that asylum seekers, they'll be economic migrants. They'll come, they'll take all of our jobs, and it will be terrible. And what I'm trying to say is that, that's the wrong way to think about it. Turns out that's not at all the case. There's no evidence for that. The reason is our asylum policies operate under a kind of colonial logic that puts human beings in a hierarchy of human worth. Nobody will admit this. Like, this is not a thing this people are saying. But if you look at how things are phrased, you see these logics. So I want to use a new concept of history, how to think about bringing history to bear in the present, that acknowledges that people in the present have agency. No one's just replicating things that happened in the past. And also that the past is still relevant to understanding contemporary injustices, but in this more subtle, nuanced way. Liberal philosophers are going to think this is terrible, and post-colonial philosophers are going to think I don't go far enough, but that's a sweet spot in philosophy.
Wells, and if you've heard of me, it's probably because you have like a health sciences friend who's complaining about their bioethics class or something like that. So I mostly teach moral and social problems in healthcare, but I also teach a bunch of other applied ethics classes: tech and human values, environmental ethics, philosophy of war, ancient philosophy, Chinese philosophy. And we're trying desperately to get philosophy of war to run more, and for big data bioethics to run more. So if those courses crop up on your list, that'd be lovely. Love it. So that's my teaching side. I also do Ethics Bowl, as Professor Shorey mentioned earlier. But I want to talk a little bit about what research I'm doing right now. And I'm going to use a vulgar word a lot because that's actually a technical term in philosophy, and I think it's worth exploring because I actually think it's a really cool innovation when philosophers start to talk about bullshit a lot. So here's just a standard kind of Google Books Ngram viewer, which just sort of tracks the rate at which a word is used in their database of books. And the word I am looking at here is grifter, because if you hang out in certain spaces like I do, there's a lot of grifter talk lately. And I got a text message from my roommate and sometime co-author, Megan Mitchell, and she texted me and she said, Mark, what do people say in business ethics? Because that's another thing I occasionally do. What do people say in business ethics about grift and grifters? And I was like, I have no idea. And so I looked, and it turns out nothing at all. Literally, if you search philosophy databases like Phil Papers, for the word grift, you just get a lot of references to like begrift or like some German word, right? So you're just like, okay, cool, good. But if you look, right, it's like we have this like little bump of grifter in the 20s, and then nothing, take off in the Reagan era, and then it's like really going now. And so I was like, what is happening? So like a lot of people seem to be talking about grifters, but nobody seems that interested in studying grifters, right? And this pattern of like not much study holds both in sociology, economics, political science, and so on, as well as philosophy. And so Megan and I got together and we were like, I think, maybe what's happening here is a lot of these academics or people, well, one, they aren't as terminally online as we are, but on the other hand, maybe also they just think like grift means scam, or grift is just like fraud, or is covered by our other categories perfectly well, and this is just indicates a slight linguistic shift. But we actually think maybe this linguistic shift is actually demarcating or picking out a kind of novel phenomenon. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to write a paper, a kind of exploratory, speculative paper, trying to tease out that phenomenon a little bit, maybe put some outline on it, and basically open the door for further research and see, hopefully eventually get to the point where we can actually investigate this stuff rigorously. And so we're coming up with a slogan, and our slogan is, fraudsters are to deceit as grifters are to bullshit. And so the basic idea here is that, like, if we understand bullshit in this technical way, and here I am just absolutely stealing from some guy named Don Fallis, and his excellent paper on bullshit with Andrew Stoke, which is basically, bullshit is a kind of indifference to evidence for truth. It's more complicated than that, and I kind of think, and so one way to think about grifters is like, okay, here are people who are like aiming for material gain by essentially weaponizing their indifference, or like using their indifference in a certain kind of way. And what we want to do is we want to highlight that, okay, well, maybe if we understand grifters in this way, right, we can differentiate it from other kinds of scammy ideas like fraud and corruption. And so here we have, we're starting to think through, this is all very tentative, but we're trying to think through like different kinds of grifters who don't seem to match the fraud paradigm or the corruption paradigm. So we have this case with Elizabeth Targ. You may not have heard of her because she died in 2002, but she started to get a lot of money towards the end of her life because she had studies that she thought were demonstrating that prayer groups at a distance could improve health outcomes for people. But then when you actually start to look at her stuff nowadays, from sort of looking back on it, it turns out she was just doing real shoddy science. She was doing the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, right? Which is making a hypothesis after you've analyzed your data set. Bad news. But you look at her and she clearly believes it. She's a lifelong believer in psychic powers. So she's not a fraudster. She's not lying to you. She's not deceiving you. She's not trying to get you to believe something she thinks is false. She believes it hard. And so anyway, that's what we're exploring. We're kind of trying to pick through it, and then we're going to say a little bit of something about LLMs, but basically out of time. If you're interested, please talk to me about any of this stuff. So that's it.
Down arrow to advance.
Hi, I'm John. I work in comparative religious ethics, and some of my research recently has been in Mencius. It's an early Confucian. Am I the first guy to do non-Western stuff? Yes. Okay. So I'm gonna fill out this presentations a bit. So Mencius was known for a series of human nature. He basically thought that we are born good with native social impulses, and that the problem was that we didn't have the necessary material conditions to thrive. So this paper, which is coming out in the Journal of Contemplative Studies, looks at how contemplative practices figure into a holistic program of moral development, which I think is very progressive. Like, people usually don't talk about the circulation of vital energy in terms of moral development, but this is something that he kind of incorporated into his research, into his writings. And I think a part of the reason why we don't think about early Confucians as doing this kind of stuff is because we have a bias, at least some people in the room have a bias against Confucians as sort of pedantic scholars, right? Like a lot of philosophers. And they don't really think about Confucians as engaging in these kinds of practices. We usually think about Taoists as doing this or Buddhists, but they're doing this. So one of the interesting things about Mencius, the things that he says about human nature, is that it kind of aligns with what a lot of modern social scientists are doing in regard to primate behavior and also infant behavior in terms of their pro-social attitudes when they're very young. So this is one early Russian comparative zoopsychologist, and she's talking about one of her subjects, a chimp named Joni, right? And she's discussing how it's very difficult for her to get him to do anything. He's very unruly, but whenever she pretends that she's crying, he immediately comes down and he tries to figure out what's wrong. He actually rests her face, looks at her, and you can tell that there's a level of empathetic concern with this chimp. People at Yale have been doing research on the behavior of infants, right? Pre-verbal infants who express pro-social attitudes just by looking, by reaching out with their hands, right? They can't talk yet, but they do these things. And I think there's a lot of common ground between this social scientific research and Mencius, who also talks about these native pro-social impulses that all human beings have. So this idea of empathetic concern, all of us have what he calls the sprouts of goodness, right? Everyone is born with these sprouts, right? Regardless of race, gender, sex, nationality. And he has this thought experiment of a baby at a well, right? So he says, imagine you come across a baby about to fall into a well. Right? He says that all of us, regardless of who we are, would feel distress and alarm and would want to save the baby, right? Not all of us would save the baby, but we would be distressed and alarmed. Most of us would save the baby, right? Unless it was like the wrong kind of baby, then we wouldn't save it. But most of us would try to save the baby, but at least we would have feelings of empathetic concern. So he says that all of us have these, right? These hearts, the literal character for heart. We have these sprouts of goodness. The issue is that we tend to not take care of them. And he cites one of the reasons as being that we don't have material necessities to live, right? So he's a very progressive political thinker. He basically believed in a welfare state, and he thought that it was the responsibility of the government, the king, the emperor, to provide things like shelter, food, clothing, a livable wage, low taxes, right? And he says that these are the material conditions that you need in order for you to pursue goodness. And he says that if the government doesn't provide this, then we have the right to revolt. So these would be like what you might call the external material conditions for moral cultivation. Right? He says it's unfair to expect people to become good if they can't eat, if they don't have a job, if they don't have clothing and shelter. But then I think what's interesting about what he's doing is that he also says, oops, no.
Something else.
He also says that we need internal material conditions. So he's talking about mental calm. He's talking about the proper circulation of vital energy or qi. And he says that we need to engage in practices like the circulation of qi, like breathing meditation, restorative sleep, mental calm, all these things that we need in order for us to actually think about doing what is right and what is virtuous. Right? So again, it's a very progressive view of moral cultivation that he has that combines the external elements of welfare, material welfare, and then also the internal psychophysiological conditions that we need before we can actually become good. So I'll be teaching this in a seminar in the spring on early Chinese philosophy. Thank you.
to all our speakers. I had it upside down, that's why. Okay, okay. Q&A, so we have a little bit of time for Q&A. So feel free to ask questions to any of the speakers. And yeah.
I have a question for Jung.
Yeah.
Jung, I was just wondering, why do you think the Confucians get such a bad rap around these issues? Like, why does everyone think Taoism is so cool? Because I'm with you, so I just don't know what the explanation.
I think that a lot of it has to do with the study of comparative mysticism and the way that most Western scholars of comparative mysticism, like William James or Walter Stace, have focused on experience as a category of comparison. So early Confucians don't really think about experience as the endpoint, right? They don't see any soteriological value in just having a mystical experience. They're much more pragmatic about these kinds of experiences, and they want to apply these experiences to daily life, to morality, to ethics, to government, to things like ritual behavior. So I think Western theorists have oftentimes neglected early Confucians in terms of seeing this, because experience is such a vital category for Western theorists. And then also secondly, I think a lot of early Confucian texts, they're not as rich in terms of how they articulate these contemplative practices, because a lot of times, for example, Mencius, he's writing in shorthand in terms of what he means by, for example, circulating the qi, right? So he talks in very kind of shorthand ways, where he's expecting the audience to understand the context of the practices that he's talking about, right? So when he talks about, like, for example, restorative sleep, he's talking about how we need a good night's sleep to fully appreciate the positive effects of morning qi, morning vital energy, right? People thought that there were different times of the day when you would have access to different kinds of qi or vital energy. And sometimes it would go stale, right? And the freshest kind of qi was in the morning. This is why we need a good night's rest. So, like, all of you understand this, right? If you don't get enough sleep, like 10 hours, you're gonna feel awful the next day, and like you're not gonna be able to do the stuff that you need to do, like co-ops or whatever. So I think that Mencius, he was like a genius. But also the thing is, he was interacting at centers of thought like the Jisha Academy, where he was rubbing elbows with not only other scholars and philosophers, but physicians and doctors, right, who had their actual written ways or written Taos that they were imparting to not only other scholars and philosophers, but kings, right? So all of this was kind of taken for granted or assumed by other thinkers during the era. It's just that Mencius doesn't tend to be as fulsome in his descriptions of these mystical practices as like for example, Taoists, right? Who talk about them at length because they think about the experience of mystical union or oneness as being the end point of cultivation, of self-cultivation. Yeah. So like, I think those are the two reasons.
Even ask this question, I just want to say thanks everybody for coming, and I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank Donna Kay for putting it together, and I want to thank Dearney for making it happen. So, like, quick round of applause.
I have a question about like the Red King.
Me, oh, okay.
You mentioned it slightly that there's different cases for when one or the other hypothesis is valid, right? Could you expand upon like what are the circumstances?
actually pretty simple. When the nature of the interaction between the host and the symbiont species is static, it's good to be slow. You get to dictate the terms of the interaction. But when the interaction itself can change, or there's novelty introduced at a relatively regular pace, then the environment is not as stable, and that's when it's good to be fast.
How easy is it to determine that stability? Is that like a pretty quick thing, or?
Yeah, so the question is how quickly are novel strategies or types or behaviors introduced into the two populations?
Because this is like evolutionary stability, so this is a really large time scale, right?
Yeah. So it doesn't take much for it to be unstable.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's only a new type every billion generations. Maybe that's slow enough.
Thank you.
Questions? Great. Thanks so much for coming.
Did you guys get pastries and everything?
I have a question actually for you. I'll come around.
I'll bring some to
Actually.
Good. You have more power than you think.
About that theory about the a lot of outside coaches.
Take a pastry before you leave. We don't want anyone
Psychosis.
Pastries, cake pastries.
Yeah.
You think that relates to grifters and bull?
I got one. Are you a person who's saying the thoughts?
You have to sign in a case.
So what makes it?
Nice to meet you, Chelsea.
I got one child.
Yeah, my email, your email. I am, because I was